Best Irish music on irishradio.org.
Irish Radio it is. From the inception of the National Health Service in the UK in 1945, Irish women and men indeed were actively recruited to train and work as nurses in British hospitals. By the 1960s, approximately 30,000 Irish-born nurses were working across the NHS, constituting around 12% of all nursing staff. While many Irish families produced at least one nurse, and many of those emigrated, so far there has been a little recognition of the enormous contribution of those Irish nurses. Now, based on 45 interviews, this book tells the stories of Irish nurses in their own words, using a rich oral history and photographs. From the rigours of training to the fun of the dance halls, the book explores their life experiences as nurses and also as Irish migrants in British society. Now, the lead author on this book is Louise, who's a senior professor of sociology and director of Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre at the London Metropolitan University, and has extensively researched Irish migration in Britain. And I'm delighted to say, Louise, great to have you with us on Irish Radio.
Hi, Jerry. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon.
Lovely stuff. Louise, you're the lead author of this book, Irish Nurses in the NHS.
Yes, that's right. I co-authored the book with my colleagues Gráinne McPolin and Neha Doshi.
Yes, the book it's probably one of the first deep dives into the life of Irish nurses in the NHS, who made up a huge amount of staff.
Yes, one of the things that we really wanted to do with this book, Jerry, is to shine a light on the enormous contribution that Irish nurses had made to the NHS right from the start in 1948 when the NHS was set up. Because although lots of people kind of stories about, oh yeah, my granny was an Irish nurse or my auntie was an Irish nurse, the kind of overall scale of the contribution of Irish nurses is not well known in British society. So we really wanted to shine a light on that.
Indeed, it's been absolutely enormous. And
Gráinne is a former nurse, but I'm a sociologist. I'm an academic, so I came to this project from 30 years of doing research with Irish migrants in Britain.
Okay, but it's a fascinating book. It's published. It's called Irish Nurses in the NHS. It's released by Forecourt Press, and it delves down not alone into the work of the nurses, but also their lives.
Yes, we really wanted to tell the story of these nurses from their growing up in Ireland, from the process of recruitment and understanding why they were recruited into the NHS and why they made the decision as teenagers, 18 years of age, to leave their home and family and travel to Britain to train in the NHS. But also then over time to see how their careers developed and their wider lives as well, marriage, children. And a very interesting point, I think, which is worth making, Jerry, is that nursing at that time was one of the very few occupations that women could do while they had small children. I'm talking now about the 50s and 60s. There were very few creches, very few nurseries, very little childcare. But as a nurse, you could work part-time, you could do the night shift, which was exhausting, but it did mean that women were able to continue working even after they had small children. So we were really fascinated to understand how they managed to juggle all of that so many years ago. And that's really an untold story.
Indeed it is, and it's truly it's amazing that the whole subject of all the nurses, the Irish nurses who worked in the NHS, hasn't been recorded at an earlier date than this.
Well, there have been some small studies that have been done here and there over the years, but no, there hasn't really been any proper acknowledgement, I think, of the contribution that Irish nurses have made. As one of the nurses in our book said, it's like Irish nurses went under the radar. They were here in huge numbers. Everybody knows that they were here, but the kind of sum total of their contribution has never really been publicly acknowledged in Britain. And so what we're trying to do with this project, with the book, but also with the photographic exhibition, the documentary film, and the podcast series is to shine a light on that in British society and to try and get some kind of recognition of Irish nurses' contribution since the 1940s. So to the whole history of the NHS.
Indeed, excellent stuff. Now, where can people find the podcast, etc.?
So the podcast is available on Acast or anywhere where you normally get your podcasts. And it's simply called Irish Nurses in the NHS. And if you Google that, you'll come up with the podcast series. And we have 9 episodes in the podcast, which is really great because you get to actually hear the voices of the nurses telling their own stories in their own words.
Indeed. And I think it's fair to say that probably most hospitals right throughout the UK would not be able to operate without the contribution of those Irish nurses.
Oh, absolutely. When the NHS was set up in the 1940s, it was really a unique and pioneering initiative. But it was clear from the get-go that they just did not have enough staff to run the NHS. So they were recruiting young women and some men as well, but primarily young women from Ireland from the late 1940s. And actually in the book, we have some images of newspaper advertisements from as early as 1949, I believe in the Cork Examiner. We have an example of what those newspaper advertisements looked like. And you can see how enticing they were to really encourage these young people to come and train as nurses. They even paid their fares to come over to start working in the NHS. So they really needed the Irish nurses right from the beginning.
Indeed so, and no doubt it was a huge cultural shock for those young, mainly women coming from certainly many rural areas in Ireland and coming to cities like London and Birmingham, etc.
Yes, absolutely, and it's even difficult to imagine that nowadays because, of course, we have television, we have the internet, we have social media, but in those days, before television, most of those young people really had no image of what life in Britain would be like, except for what they saw in magazines or what they saw at the cinema. And of course, many of our participants were in for quite a shock, indeed, in some cases, a disappointment, because Britain was certainly not as glamorous as they had been led to believe by the movies that they'd been watching or the kind of glossy magazines that they'd been reading. In fact, Britain in the late 40s and early 50s was quite poor and areas were quite run down in the aftermath of the war. And we have a funny story in the book, which your listeners might be interested in, that one of the nurses arrived in Britain in 1952 as an adventurous teenager. And she was absolutely horrified to discover that rationing was still in place in Britain in the 1950s. The rationing didn't end after the war. It continued for years. So having grown up on a farm in Ireland, she was horrified to discover that her little butter and her little bit of cheese was rationed every week. So the culture shock was something that had both some positive elements, but also some nasty surprises as well.
Indeed, I bet, and then of course there was the complete different scene, different living arrangements, and everything from they had growing up at home.
Yes, for many of them, this was the first time they'd ever been away from home. Some of them had never been outside of their local village or town. One of our nurses was saying she'd never seen a telephone, she'd never used a telephone. So really, they were coming into a completely different environment when they entered into this hospital space. But of course, they also had this wonderful amenity that they were all living in the nurse's home. So unlike other Irish migrants at the time, they didn't have to go looking for digs or looking for boarding houses. They were guaranteed accommodation. However, some of them said that the nurse's home was a bit like being in a boarding school. There were lots of strict rules that they had to abide by.
Indeed, I bet it was a different world back then. Louise, listeners, it's been lovely speaking to you, and the book is available now. It's Irish Nurses in the NHS. It's available from Forecourt Press, also all good book outlets. Louise, listeners, it's been lovely speaking to you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's been a pleasure.